For 35 years, they told the world one thing with absolute consistency. The Islamic Republic does not negotiate under pressure. It does not bend under sanctions. It does not fracture under isolation. Every Western diplomat who predicted its collapse was proven wrong. Every analyst who declared the regime terminally weakened watched it survive, reconstitute, and emerge more rigid than before. The architecture of the Islamic Republic was built specifically to endure, not to thrive, not to prosper, but to endure. That calculation has now collapsed. In a single 72-hour window that began on a Tuesday morning in Tehran, 3 of the most powerful men in the Islamic Republic's parallel governing structure submitted their resignations. Not under military pressure, not under foreign coercion. They resigned because the internal machinery of the regime has reached a breaking point so fundamental, so structurally irreversible, that remaining inside the apparatus has become more dangerous than walking away from it. The supreme leader's inner circle, the most fortified political structure in the modern Middle East, is disintegrating from the inside. Read that again. Not protests in the streets, not a military coup, not American bombs. The men who built this system, who maintained it through 40 years of crisis, are abandoning it. And the full weight of what that means for every calculation in the Middle East has not yet landed. What happened inside Tehran in these last 72 hours is not a political story. It is not a diplomatic story. It is the beginning of the most consequential political unraveling in the Islamic Republic's history. And the mechanism that produced it has been operating invisibly for 8 months, built not by Washington's military planners, but by Iran's own internal contradictions, compounded by 3 simultaneous crises that no single governing structure could absorb simultaneously. Stay with this, because what comes next in Iran will reshape every theater of conflict from the Red Sea to the South China Sea, and the window to understand what is actually happening is closing faster than most observers recognize. To understand why these resignations are historically shattering, it is necessary to understand what these men actually represented. The Islamic Republic is not a government in the conventional Western sense. It is a layered system of competing power centers held together not by institutional loyalty, but by mutual dependency. At its foundation sits the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, 85 years old in deteriorating health that his office has officially denied for 3 consecutive years. Around that foundation, concentric rings of power operate semi-independently. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with its own intelligence apparatus, its own economic empire valued at approximately $140 billion, and its own foreign policy machinery operating in parallel to the formal foreign ministry. Then the clerical establishment of Qom, which provides the theological legitimacy without which the entire edifice becomes simply a military dictatorship without divine sanction. Then the elected civilian government, currently led by President Masoud Pezeshkian, who won his position in 2024 on a reformist platform, and has spent every day since discovering the precise dimensions of his own powerlessness. These structures do not cooperate. They compete. They surveil each other. They maintain dossiers on each other. The IRGC Intelligence Directorate has files on every elected official. The clerical establishment monitors the IRGC for theological deviations. The president's office leaks damaging information about IRGC commercial activities to selected foreign journalists as a pressure mechanism. This is not dysfunction. This is how the system was designed by Khomeini himself, who understood that competing power centers could never unite against him if they were too busy competing against each other. For 4 decades, this architecture held, not elegantly, not efficiently, but it held. 3 months ago, it began to fracture in a way that the system's designers never anticipated, and its current managers have no mechanism to repair. The fracture did not begin with any single event. It began with the simultaneous arrival of 3 compounding pressures that each individually would have been manageable. Together, they have created a structural load the regime cannot distribute. The first pressure is economic. The Iranian rial has lost 63% of its value against the dollar in the last 14 months. Inflation is running at officially acknowledged rates of 47%, with independent economists placing the real figure closer to 68% for basic food and household goods. The oil sector, which funds approximately 40% of the government's operational budget, is producing 2.8 million barrels per day, but selling roughly half of that through the shadow network of falsely flagged tankers and Chinese purchase agreements that keep the revenue machinery functional. The other half sits in storage, or moves through routes that extract 30 to 40% of market value in intermediary fees paid to the brokers, the shipping companies, and the port officials who make the evasion system work. Here is what they fail to understand about the trap they were sitting in. The second pressure is generational. The women, life, freedom movement that erupted in September 2022 following the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody did not end. Western media declared it resolved when street protests declined in early 2023. It was not resolved. It transformed. The organizational networks that emerged from those protests, the encrypted communication channels, the distributed leadership structures deliberately designed to have no identifiable center that could be decapitated, continued operating underground. By early 2025, those networks had established functional communication links with disaffected elements inside the IRGC's lower officer ranks. Not the generals, not the colonels. the captains and lieutenants, the 32 to 40-year-old officers who joined a revolutionary institution and discovered they were managing a commercial empire for the benefit of their superiors' families. The third pressure is succession. Khamenei's health, officially denied and unofficially discussed in every power center in Tehran, has reached a stage where the question of succession is no longer theoretical. It is operational. The Assembly of Experts, the 88-member clerical body constitutionally empowered to select the next supreme leader, has been meeting in emergency sessions since January 2026. Those sessions are not ceremonial. They are negotiations between factions whose interest in the outcome could not be more direct. Whoever controls the succession process controls the Islamic Republic for the next generation. Now look at what this means not just for Tehran, but for every calculation across the entire regional architecture simultaneously. The resignations that occurred this week did not happen in isolation. They happened because the succession negotiation reached a crisis point that made the cost of remaining inside the system higher than the cost of departure. The three men who resigned are not reformists. They are not liberals. They are hardline operators who spent decades building the apparatus of repression that the regime depends on to function. General Ahmad Vahidi, former IRGC intelligence commander who had been serving in an informal advisory capacity to the Supreme Leader's office despite his formal removal from official positions. Ayatollah Mohammad Yazdi, 87 years old, one of the most powerful voices in the calm clerical establishment, whose authority within the Assembly of Experts made him effectively the kingmaker in any succession scenario. And Saeed Jalili, three-time presidential candidate, former nuclear negotiator, the man whose name appeared on every internal succession shortlist as the hardline faction's preferred candidate for supreme leader. These three men do not agree on theology. They do not agree on economic policy. They do not agree on the nuclear program's future. They have spent 20 years in institutional conflict with each other across overlapping bureaucratic territories. They agree on one thing. The current trajectory leads to catastrophic collapse, and the men currently managing that trajectory are not capable of changing course. The resignation letters, portions of which have been shared with selected foreign journalists through channels that suggest deliberate strategic leaking rather than accidental disclosure, contain language that would have been unimaginable from these individuals 12 months ago. Yazdi's letter describes the governing apparatus as having deviated so fundamentally from the principles of the revolution that continued participation constitutes complicity in what he calls a betrayal of the Imam's legacy. This is not theological criticism. This is a clerical declaration that the regime has lost its legitimacy from within the very institution that provides the only legitimacy it possesses. What was found in those letters changes everything, because the most dangerous revelation is not what they say about the present. It is what they reveal about what these men know about the succession plan. Intelligence assessments from 3 separate Western agencies, shared with allied governments in the last 48 hours, have reached the same analytical conclusion through different evidentiary paths. The resignation of these 3 specific individuals at this specific moment is not coincidental. It is coordinated, and the coordination suggests that they have concluded the current succession plan. The mechanism being assembled inside Khamenei's office for the transfer of supreme religious authority is not what they were promised it would be. The candidate who appears to be emerging as the preferred option within Khamenei's immediate circle is Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's second son. Mojtaba is 56 years old, has no formal clerical credentials at the level required for the position of supreme leader under the Constitution, has spent his career operating as his father's political enforcer through the IRGC intelligence apparatus, and has approximately 0 support within the traditional clerical establishment in Qom. He has one asset. His father's declining capacity to manage the succession process himself creates a window in which the apparatus his son controls, the surveillance infrastructure, the intelligence files, the financial leverage over every significant actor in the system, can be deployed to manufacture the outcome that formal theological credentials cannot. Yazdi, Vahidi, and Jalili have concluded that this manufacturing is underway, and they have decided that the historical record requires their names not to be on it. This is where the arithmetic becomes devastating, not for the regime's opponents, for the regime itself. The clerical establishment of Qom represents the theological foundation without which the Islamic Republic becomes the Islamic Republic in name only. The IRGC's legitimacy as a revolutionary institution, rather than simply a military organization, depends on the theological sanction of exactly the kind of senior clerics who are now publicly distancing themselves from the succession process. Without that sanction, the IRGC becomes a Praetorian Guard protecting a political dynasty rather than a revolutionary force defending divine governance. There are men in the IRGC who understand this distinction. There are men who join specifically because of the distinction. And they are having conversations that the intelligence apparatus does not have complete visibility into, because the intelligence apparatus is controlled by Mojtaba's network, and his network has been focused on the succession political maneuvering rather than the institutional monitoring that would have detected what was developing below the surface. The most dangerous complication is not what the hardliners are doing. It is what the reformists and the population are calculating in response. Pezeshkian, the president who was elected on promises he understood from day one he could not keep, has been watching these developments with the specific attentiveness of a man who has been waiting for a window. His government has no formal role in the succession process. The presidency in the Islamic Republic is constitutionally subordinate to the supreme leader in every domain that matters. But a president who positions himself correctly in a succession crisis, who maintains relationships with all factions while appearing threatening to none, who represents the civilian institutional continuity that a fractured succession process desperately needs, occupies a different position than the constitutional text describes. Pezeshkian met with the German foreign minister 8 days ago in a session that his office described as covering regional security and economic cooperation. The German foreign minister's office described it identically. Neither description mentions the 45 minutes at the end of that session for which no notes were taken and no interpreters were present beyond those brought personally by each principal. There are now 19 days before the Assembly of Experts is constitutionally required to convene a formal session on the succession question. 19 days in which the fractures visible this week will either widen into a structural break or be papered over by a negotiated accommodation that satisfies none of the parties but prevents immediate collapse. The clock has not been this close to midnight since the revolution itself. What comes next is not determined. It is being decided in Tehran, in Qom, in the corridors of IRGC facilities in Shiraz and Isfahan, and the command centers northeast of Tehran where the men who actually control the physical instruments of state power are doing their own arithmetic. That arithmetic has 3 variables that no external observer can fully assess. The first is Khamenei's actual medical condition. The officially denied reports are not fabrications. They are understatements. The question is not whether a succession crisis is coming. The question is whether it arrives in a time frame that allows managed transition or one that forces improvised response under pressure. The second variable is the IRGC's internal cohesion. Vahidi's resignation removes the most significant stabilizing figure within the hardline military faction. He was the man whose institutional relationships spanned the revolutionary generation and the current operational commanders. Without him as a mediating presence, the competition between IRGC factions for positioning in the succession process becomes unmediated. An unmediated competition within an institution that controls nuclear facilities, missile systems, and the physical security apparatus of the state is not a political problem. It is a strategic emergency. The third variable is the street. The organizational networks from 2022 have been monitoring these developments in real time. The leaders of those networks, operating from locations outside Iran and through the encrypted infrastructure that the IRGC never fully penetrated, are making their own calculations about whether the moment of maximum regime vulnerability has arrived. Their assessment is not uniform. There are factions that argue for patience, for allowing the internal fracture to widen before any external pressure is applied that might create the nationalist response that has historically allowed the regime to reconsolidate. There are factions that believe the window for action is closing precisely because the regime, weakened as it is, will find a way to survive if given 19 days without escalating pressure. The decision those factions reach in the next 72 hours will determine whether Iran's internal crisis remains a controlled implosion or becomes something that draws in every regional actor simultaneously. Because the regional actors are already positioning, Saudi Arabia has quietly suspended the back-channel negotiations with Tehran that had been running through Iraqi intermediaries since March 2024. The suspension is not a rupture. It is a pause, the kind of pause that sophisticated diplomatic operators execute when they need to see which structure emerges from a collapsing building before they decide which foundation to build on next. Israel's intelligence assessment, shared with the Biden administration in its final weeks and updated for the current administration, describes the Iranian succession crisis as the most significant strategic opportunity since the 1979 revolution itself, and simultaneously as the most dangerous moment for regional stability since the same event. The opportunity and the danger are the same phenomenon viewed from different angles. A weakened and fractured Islamic Republic cannot project the force that has kept Iranian proxies operational from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, but a fracturing nuclear-armed state, with contested command authority over its strategic weapons programs, is not an opportunity. It is a category of risk that has no historical precedent in the modern Middle East. The Biden administration passed a classified assessment to the current administration describing 3 scenarios for Iranian succession. The assessment has not been updated. The events of the last 72 hours have made all 3 scenarios obsolete. What is not obsolete is the underlying reality that no administration in Washington has a fully developed response architecture for the scenario that is now unfolding. The interagency process that would normally develop that architecture is 3 months into its reorganization. The National Security Council staff that would coordinate across CIA, DIA, state, and DoD on an integrated Iran strategy is staffed at approximately 60% of its previous capacity. The men and women who understand this gap are not sleeping comfortably this week. There is one more layer to this story that has received no attention in any major Western publication, and it is the layer that will matter most when historians write about this period. The resignations of Yazdi, Vahidi, and Jalili are not, by themselves, structurally fatal to the Islamic Republic. Regimes have survived the defection of senior figures before. What makes this moment categorically different is what those resignations communicate to the hundreds of second-tier figures, the deputy ministers, the mid-level IRGC commanders, the provincial intelligence chiefs, the judges and prosecutors whose participation in the daily mechanics of the regime makes it function, about the cost-benefit calculation of continued loyalty. Every single one of those individuals is watching. Every single one is running their own arithmetic. They have families, they have assets, some within Iran, some placed outside through the financial engineering that the sanctions regime inadvertently incentivized. They have relationships with potential successors in multiple factions. And they are all asking the same question that Yazdi and Vahidi and Jalili asked before submitting their letters: which side of this transition will I want my name to be on? When that question is asked by enough people simultaneously, the answer becomes self-fulfilling. The regime does not fall because its opponents defeat it. It falls because the people required to sustain it decide that the cost of sustaining it exceeds the benefit of the protection it provides. That threshold, the point at which individual calculation of survival overrides institutional loyalty, is not visible from outside the system. It is not visible from inside the system either, until it is crossed. The men who resigned this week crossed it. They are watching to see who follows. In Qom, the clerical seminaries are having conversations that have not happened since 1989, when Khomeini died and the question of succession was last definitively answered. Those conversations are not about theology. They are about what the Islamic Republic is, what it has become, and what it will be permitted to become if the current trajectory continues. In Washington, the analysts who cover Iran have not slept in 48 hours. The reporting traffic from Tehran station has tripled. The interagency distribution list for Iran-related intelligence products has expanded to include offices that are not normally read into this material. Something is being prepared. What exactly is being prepared, and whether it will be ready before the 19-day window closes, is not yet determined. The situation in Iran is not resolved. It is not resolving? It is accelerating toward a moment of decision that the regime's architects spent 40 years engineering mechanisms to prevent, and those mechanisms are failing simultaneously in multiple locations across multiple institutional domains. The clock is running. The men in the rooms where the actual decisions are being made have fewer than 3 weeks to reach a settlement that none of them fully want, in a context where the cost of failure is not political embarrassment, but the structural collapse of the only system that protects all of them simultaneously. Whether they find that settlement, whether the apparatus holds long enough to manufacture a succession that the clerical establishment will accept and the IRGC will enforce, and the population will not immediately reject on the streets, is the question that will define the next decade of Middle Eastern history. The answer is still being written. In Tehran and Qom, and the secure communications channels between faction leaders who have spent their entire careers in mutual opposition and are now discovering that their interests have, for the first time, structurally converged. Not because they agree, but because they are all afraid of the same thing. What that thing is, what it will mean when it arrives, and who will be positioned to shape what comes after it, will be the subject of the next chapter in this story. That chapter is already being written, and when it becomes visible, the world will understand that what began this week in Tehran was not a resignation. It was a signal. The question now is who received it, what they intend to do with it, and whether the window for doing anything at all remains open long enough for those intentions to become actions. The clock has never been closer to midnight.